Well, listen, good morning, everybody. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here to be the introducer to Elissa Kaplan, who we all know as being an extremely talented individual. And thank you for joining us, the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County, for our first book talk of 2022. I am Peter Lilienthal, and I'm the new president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. We're so grateful that our book talks are being underwritten by Marcy Schoenfeld in honor of her beloved parents, Rose and Abraham Schoenfeld, and by Eileen Belinsky and Susan Trotz in memory of their beloved parents, Eleanor and Nathan Belinsky. Today, Dr. Elissa Kaplan will tell us about the book Rebel Daughter by Laurie Banov Kaufman, one of the books on the Jewish Book Council, and on Hadassah lists of recommended books. We'll get a bird's eye view of what it would have been like to live in Jerusalem at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. I think you all know Dr. Elissa Kaplan. She's the founder and director of Growing Projects, an educational consulting company whose vision is leadership through critical thinking and compassionate choices. Elissa earned degrees in German language and literature, comparative literature, education, Judaic studies, and a doctorate in educational leadership. Over a 17-year period, she served as director of education at 4 synagogues in Maryland and Connecticut. Elissa has been on the board of JHSFC, and you all know her as our prior president. Phenomenal job. And the very fact is that she is, in addition, a facilitator at Lifetime Learners in the Institute of Norwalk, a featured guest speaker at synagogues, and a presenter at conferences and research in Jewish education. I think we'd all agree that we've been gifted to be a part of what Elissa's background has been. And thank you for the book talk today, Elissa. And by the way, David and Elissa, are now in their 15th home here in Stamford, Connecticut.
So thank you.
Take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter, for that lovely and kind introduction. And thank you, Marcy, for being Education Program Vice President and putting all these things together, these book talks and the programs and other events that Jewish Historical Society so proudly shares. So let's see if I can proudly share. All right. All right, let's start the slideshow. Okay, we're off and running. So today I'm going to talk about the Rebel Daughter. Oh, but before I do that, I better turn off my subtitles. My computer thinks that I need subtitles, and sometimes I do. Do you know about Rebel Daughter cookies? I just found out about them myself, and they're local Connecticut firm. They're brand new, and they look delicious, and it's a great name, and it sort of fits our theme for today. And boy, I wish I had a dozen of them right now. They're actually out of somebody's home, but they cook at a professional kitchen in Norwalk. Okay, well, back to the actual book. Rebel Daughter is written by Laurie Banov Kaufman. And on the right, you see one of the stars of this book, the temple in Jerusalem. And I just like to point out, look how golden it is. This is, of course, a painting, but look how big it is. And look at the people who are there. And you might see in the middle the main feature of the temple, which is that column of smoke, which was sacrifices. So there's a lot of talk about that. On the left, you see some pottery that would be typical of the time.
I'm willing to die for our freedom.
Don't you have anything to live for?
As long as Rome threatens us, there's nothing worth living for.
That's not what our book says. God commanded us to choose life.
In the first century, a small Jewish province rebelled against the Roman Empire. Legions of well-trained and fearsome soldiers were sent to crush the rebellion. They destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. At stake was the survival of the Jewish people. Based on a true story, Rebel Daughter is about a young woman determined to protect her family at all costs, to live her life in freedom and dignity, and to find love. I'm Laurie Banauf Kaufman, and this is my book.
Okay, if I let it go on a little bit longer, it'll say order the book now, please. Okay, so what kind of book is this book that Laurie Banauf Kaufman wrote? Well, it fits into a lot of different categories. It is mainly historical fiction, but it's also Jewish history. It's also a coming of age story. It's a big culture clash between the Romans and the Jews, and it is indeed a feminist story as well. What do critics have to say about this book? Well, the Jewish Book Council with Emily Schneider comes in to say highly recommended story. There's an author's note, there's a historical note by Professor Jonathan Price of Tel Aviv University, and Laurie Banauf Kaufman did work with him for years to do the research and understand the background of this. What about Kirkus reviews? Well, they say that it's remarkable, mysterious, meticulously researched, but you'll notice at the end they say it's let down by an unnecessarily lengthy plot. And I do want to say a little bit about that because I've talked to some people who've actually read the book, and I'd be interested in hearing your comments about that too. It does seem to go on and on and on. However, there's a point to that. So let's go look at, see what Goodreads has to say. Of course, they're also selling it, but they're saying it's thrilling and impassioned. It's based on real characters, meticulous research. And that is, I agree, that's really true. And Blue Greenberg, who's the founder of the Orthodox Jewish Feminist Alliance, says highly readable and will hold your interest from the first page to the last. In fact, you're really rooting for our main character, Esther, all the way through the book. So you can see that different people on her website, our author shows that different book groups, women, adult women, younger women. She even has pictures of young men's group who have read this book and they're all smiling, but they're also all eating. Maybe that's it. So I have a picture down here of Game of Thrones because this book reminds me a little bit of Game of Thrones. Why? Because everyone in the book dies. So they seem to kill off every main character one after another. And so you're rooting for except for the main character, spoiler alert, she makes it through the whole book. Who is Laurie Banauf Kaufman, our author? Well, she's an American who made Aliyah to Israel. She was born in New Orleans and grew up in Charleston. She's well educated with degrees from Princeton and Harvard. When they were living in Boston, she and her husband wrote a book called The Ice Cream Lover's Guide to Boston, which she fondly and admits did not sell very many copies. But this book that she wrote now will. She worked as a strategy consultant for high tech, and she lives in Israel with her husband and 4 adult children. I'm going to look at the book through its literary elements. And on the left, you see a picture of an ordinary house. That might be the house that our main character lived in. You can see that it has sort of a ground floor. There was also a cellar. You can go up to the middle floor. You can sit outside on the roof. There's even a scene on the book where the mother is talking about another girl, the age of our main character, Esther, who sits on the roof and spins her cloth so that all of the young men walking by can see her and will want to marry her. And of course, our main character, Esther, says, "Foo to that." Okay, on the right, you see a picture of Jerusalem and the temple. And this, and here's the Roman army down at the bottom. This is the time of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem from a 19th century painting. The city was under siege for a long time by the Romans, and that was a very terrible time, which we hear about in the book. And then it gets the temple gets destroyed, the city gets destroyed, and most of the population actually flee. How can we relate to this particular incident? Well, in my lifetime, the only thing I could think of was 9/11. And so take yourself back to 2001 and think how you felt when you saw the pictures of that plane approaching the two towers and it burst into flame. What did that do to you? How did you feel? Was it despair? Was it fear? Was it tragedy? Did you feel overcome? Did you want to go hide? Did you know what to do? So all of those things come out in the era we're talking about of the destruction of the Second Temple. Where is this book set? Well, it's set in Rome and Jerusalem. So how many people have actually been to Jerusalem? Oh yeah, lots of people have been to Jerusalem. So, and you've seen, how many people have been to Rome? Yeah, lots of people. So these are places that we all know about and we can relate to. So on the top, you see a mock-up of Jerusalem. This is, I think, from Holy Land Hotel, if you've been there. But here's the temple, and here's the city spread out around it. And so we have this beautiful architecture. Here we have Rome, and have you been to the Colosseum? You probably have if you've been to Rome. Right, beautiful architecture, large urban city. So our book is set in two urban settings, and it talks about the different levels of society. They're both crossroads of people and cultures, although Rome was more of a crossroads than Jerusalem, but it was also. You see the book Rome and Jerusalem, that was written by Martin Goodman, and he's a scholar, and he knows a lot about Jewish history and Roman history, and he talks about the cultural, political, and religious beliefs and practices of the two people, which were different. And he also points out that Rome's policy of brutality to the people they conquered was part of their policy, and it shows up in this book, and he talks about it. Now, the culture clash, the people didn't eat the same things, and there's a big deal about not eating pork. Well, you've probably heard that through a lot of Jewish history. Jews didn't like graven images, and the Jews were very superstitious. This is the Middle East. This is the evil eye area. This is the Hamsa, the hand. Right at the very opening scene of the book illustrates the culture clash. A group of Roman soldiers are walking past the main character, Esther, and her father, Hanan, who's a priest in the temple. And they don't ask him, they're teasing him about and bullying him about not eating pork. And they get into this sort of a fight, and they force him to kiss, a donkey is there, and they force him to kiss the ass of the ass. And the donkey gets excited because the soldiers are yelling and everything, and the donkey kicks Hanan and hurts him badly. And that's how our book opens, with this culture clash of the Romans bullying the Jews as they're walking through the city doing their thing. So here's Jerusalem, and this is more of a Roman view of it, but it's a nice map. So did you know that Jerusalem was known as the navel of the earth? And it's not the only ancient city with this title, though. There is only one reference to Jerusalem, to the dynasty of King David, from the pre-exile period. So we don't have a lot of backup of that early history, but we know it was there. Jerusalem is referred to 800 times in the Bible and in the New Testament. And many traditions see the Temple Mount as the highest point on earth, reaching into heaven. And all male Jews were supposed to go make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the harvest festivals, which were Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. What about Rome? Well, the Roman countryside was one of the last areas to be settled, and it was built on a defensible hill, so was Jerusalem. There are 7 hills in Rome. And it's on the Palatine Hill. Guess what? Jerusalem also has 7 hills: Mount Scopus, Mount Olivet, Mount Corruption, Mount Ophel, the original Mount Zion, New Mount Zion, and where the Antonia Fortress was built. So while Rome was a much bigger city, a much more cosmopolitan city, they were both urban settings of their time in the 1st century, about 2,000 years ago. So let me just take a quick sip. By the way, this pottery is 2,000 years old. Just kidding. All right. Who are the characters in this book? There are lots of them, and I've listed them in what I think is sort of a hierarchical order by class. There were the priests and merchants and other rich people. This was the highest level of society. Then there was a middle class with merchants and shop sellers and service providers, just like we have. And like today, there are lots of poor people, and they play a role in this book too. Now, there were 2 groups of Jews who rebelled against the Romans: the Zealots, and of course, you know, there's that old joke about Jews and synagogues. You know, one Jew on a desert island has to build 2 synagogues, the one he goes to, the one he wouldn't step into. Okay, well, anyway, the Zealots had a subgroup of people who didn't think that the Zealots went far enough in their rebellion against Rome, and these were called the Sicarii, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. The Roman soldiers, of course, play a big role in the book. They actually destroy the temple and the city and do a lot of other damage too. Then a little bit lower in our hierarchy are women and then slaves. Some say the 2 are connected, not true. Who is our main character? Well, our main character is Esther Bat Hanan. And we meet, and you can see in this picture on the left side, that's what she would have looked like at the beginning of the story. And on the right, that's not what she would have looked like, but that's her tombstone. And it was found in southern Italy. This is an actual archaeological find, and it made headlines, and our author found out about it and was intrigued. What is this? How's your Latin? If you can read it. But anyway, it says, Claudia Aster, captive from Jerusalem. Tiberius Claudius Proculus, imperial freedman, took care of this epitaph. I ask you to make sure that through the law that you take care that no one casts down my inscription. In other words, a man named Tiberius wanted a woman named Claudia Aster to be remembered. And so how did this Claudia Aster get to southern Italy? And what was her story? And how was she connected to this Roman guy? So let's find out. Now, in the background, I hear the Second Temple talking to me, saying, wait a minute, I'm a main character in this book too. So I just point that out. So what about our main character's family, Esther's family? Well, you see on the top, her father was a priest and her mother was a homemaker, and she was very talented at making all the materials they needed, the food, the clothing, the decorations. Now, Esther's mother also knew about herbs and healing potions and went around and gave those or sold those to people as well. So her father's name was Hanan, and her mother was Sarah. She has three brothers, Yehuda, who was married, the oldest, and was married first to Tabitha, and Tabitha died in childbirth. Yehuda never gets over her death. There was her brother, and Yehuda was a member of the Zealots. He was well educated. He was a student. His father educated him in all the practices and laws and readings that he could. And Yehuda was very loyal. Hanan, as the priest, was not a member of the Zealots. He thought that the Jews and the Romans could coexist. Yehuda did not think that. So Yehuda breaks away from the family and becomes a zealot, secretly at first, and finally they find out about it. Brother Shimon hated school and education and never listened to a word his father said. And he becomes also a zealot and a fighter. Both of the brothers do. He is married to Miriam. Now, when Shimon and Miriam get married, the woman moves in, woman or young girl, she's really a teen at this point, moves into the family. So Miriam and Esther become best friends. And then there's little Mati, the younger brother, and he and Esther are connected throughout the entire book from beginning to end. And she is like his mother, and she takes care of him and makes sure, promises her mom that she will always take care of him. And she really does, from the first to the last. Now, I actually woke up this morning and realized I had left one character off who is not a member of the family, but who is like a second mother to Esther, and her name is Zahara, and she's a tavern owner, and she sells things, and she has a place for prostitutes and Roman soldiers and herbs and magical potions. She's quite a character, but she's like a second mother to Esther. This is a coming of age story, this book. So there are, Esther has different prospects throughout the book. So different people that she sort of gets interested in, falls in love with, falls out of love with, hates, but thinks about all the time. Because when we meet Esther, she's has not entered puberty yet, and they're already talking about marrying her off. And at the end of the book, I think she's 19 or 20. So this is the time period. So who's the first guy? His name is Joseph. And she meets him at a Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, the wine festival, when all the young women, virgins, bless you, go out and dance in the streets in the evening and vineyards, and young men come and see which women are there and later try to hook up with them. So she sees Joseph there, and she sees him at different times. She even has seen him with his shirt off, and she just falls in love with him right away. And people keep telling her not to trust him. He later becomes known as Josephus, if anybody knows anything about him. We'll find out a little more later. Next is Tiberius. Well, Tiberius is drop dead gorgeous also, but he's Roman, and she's afraid that she's going to be struck down, or Esther's afraid she's going to be struck down by demons if she even talks to him. And Jews can't even go near or look at or talk to or be involved with Romans. However, he is kind of cute, and he does seem to come to the rescue over and over and over again. And now, finally, there's Lazar. He is a lot older than she is. He's a silversmith. He has his own business. He's a wonderful prospect. Her parents want him to marry him, but he's older, and her main thing is he's really hairy. Okay. What about people who were involved in fighting? And so this book is really about the time of war. So who were the people who were involved in that? Well, at the bottom, you can see the Roman soldiers. There are lots of them. But at the top, you can see the Jews. And the Jews staged a revolt against an empire, this huge Roman Empire. And for a while, they did pretty well. But then it didn't work out. So on the right, where it says Romans go home, you see the Zealots. They were a political party, and they really wanted to fight the Romans, and they really hated the Jews, like the priests and the upper class people who wanted to make peace and coexist with the Roman authorities. And one of their famous people was Yochanan ben Zakkai. We'll mention him too in a minute. On the left, there was a breakout group from the Zealots, and they were called Sicarii, Jewish, and they were Jews. And they carried sikai, which were small daggers concealed in their cloaks. So while the Zealots staged some guerrilla warfare, the Sicarii just wandered through the streets and assassinated people. And so the Sicarii and the Zealots were a little bit like the Stern Gang in the Haganah in more modern times. Now, the rabbis in the Talmud, hundreds of years later, thinking about the destruction of Jerusalem, because we think about it all the time, even today on Tisha B'Av, and they said, why did this happen to us? Well, they said the first temple was destroyed because we couldn't get rid of idolatry. But the second temple was a different story. The second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, Hebrew words for baseless hatred. And so the Jews were fighting each other during this time, and the Sicarii often killed off zealots who were winning battles against the Romans. We have some cameos in this book. Our author just loves history, and she threw in everything she could. So let's look at the Romans first. At the bottom, Nero makes an appearance at the beginning and as part of conversation, and you can see he's looking at Rome burn. I know there's some scholars who say it really wasn't his fault, but okay. Next, the main guy in this story and the main general who was in charge of putting down this revolt in Judea. You know, there's that movie that says never fight a land war in Asia. Well, the Romans did. They actually did win. But the main general was Vespasian. And he really plays an important role in Jewish history because of his connection with Yochanan ben Zakkai. Hang on just a minute. Okay, the third Roman, Vespasian, is called back to Rome. And so Titus takes over at the last minute, and gosh, he gets the arch with the, back in Rome, celebrating him with the, carrying off all the objects from the temple. Now, Vespasian was connected to this guy, Yochanan ben Zakkai. Who was he? Well, he was a rabbinic scholar, a rabbi, and he was in Jerusalem during the siege. He convinced the zealots to take it. The only way you could get through the walls is if you were dead. So they wrapped him up in a cloth, and they told the soldiers he was dead, and they got him out of the city. He escaped. What was his plan? His plan was to go talk to General Vespasian. And he said to the general, before this is over, you are going to be taken back to Rome. I predict you're going to be taken back to Rome and you'll be made emperor. And Vespasian said, okay, if that happens, since you've given me this piece of information that you've gotten from your holy insights, what would you like? And Yochanan ben Zakkai, those are not much. I don't really want much. You don't have, and so Vespasian says, money. He says, no. I just want to live over here on the coast and start a school for Jews. And so Vespasian says, well, that's nothing. And he says, sure, go ahead. Guess what? Vespasian gets called back to Rome before it's over. The prophecy comes true. Yohanan ben Zakkai has Roman protection. They're out in the boonies anyway. And he sets up this school. And this school of rabbis sets the course for what Jews know today as Judaism. They changed everything. This is where the beginnings of the Sanhedrin, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and all of Jewish life today. Obviously, Ben Zakkai knew the temple was going to be destroyed, and so he created something new along with his fellow rabbis, and that's what we have today. Okay, here is Joseph, who becomes Flavius Joseph. He fights with the Zealots, and then he becomes Benedict Arnold, and then goes over to the Romans and is rewarded with a villa and a wonderful life in Rome, and gets to live as a Jewish Roman Jew. Anyway, he writes a pretty big book. All right, so where did time for another sip. I hope you have your coffee with you too. What do we really know about the Second Temple? And how did Laurie Banauf Kaufman find out about it? She did a lot of, she spent about 10 years doing research. So let's take a look at where we can find information. We can look in our Musaf service, the book by Flavius Josephus, the Mishnah, which is later becomes part of the Talmud, the New Testament, and today archaeology. So if you go to services on Shabbat morning, and you stay you're in a traditional service, and you stay all the way through the Musaf service, you will read a little section about this, about sacrifices. On the Sabbath day, 2 yearling lambs without blemish, together with 2/10 of measure, an ephah of choice flour with oil mixed in as a meal offering, and with a proper libation. So every Saturday morning, every Shabbat morning at a traditional Jewish service, you get, the recipe for the Shabbat sacrifice. We're still talking about it. If you go to a liberal service on a Shabbat morning, this piece has been taken out because we don't want, the liberal side doesn't want to remember the Second Temple as a place to be rebuilt, to remember it as a piece of history and that we've moved on. So you can see that on the right that there's a priest working on the sacrifice. That's what they did 7 days a week. And at the bottom, this is where Yohanan ben Zakkai and the brilliance of the rabbis comes in. Says, we no longer have a temple, but doesn't mean we have to give up everything. We don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what about that offering on Shabbat? Well, let's bring it to our table, and let's bring challah to our table as a remembrance of those sacrifices, even if we're not going to rebuild the temple. However, I point out there are a group of people, very, very small group, mostly in Israel, but who are planning to rebuild the temple and planning to reinstitute sacrifices. So stay tuned for headlines in Haaretz. Okay, what about Josephus? Well, Josephus records numerous events of this time, and our author quotes from Josephus all the way through the book. At the end, as she has section headers, lots of them, and many of them are quotes from Josephus. He chronicles everyday life. He chronicles every part of the war, of the Great Revolt that the Jews staged against the Romans. He chronicles the destruction of the temple. So we actually have his writing from the time, from his point of view, about the history of what happened. But in terms of what actually went on in the temple, look at this. During the pilgrimage festivals, 256,500 lambs, like 250,000 lambs were sacrificed to accommodate more than close to 3 million people at the Passover celebration in 66. The temple was a really big deal. A lot of people came, and a lot of people brought these sacrifices. And what did they do with the meat? Well, all of that meat went to feed the priests. So you see here another picture of the priest walking up that ramp to where the sacrifice is. And guess what? For those of you who attend services or are familiar with Jewish liturgy, what did they say while they were walking up that ramp? Baruch Hu. Okay? And it was 15 steps. It was choreographed into 15 steps. Okay? Interesting. All right. So it could be that Josephus was exaggerating, but it was a really big deal. Now, does anything like this exist today? Actually, yes, sacrifices. There's a group of Samaritans in northern Israel, and they do kill a goat once a year in the spring at Passover time and barbecue it and eat it. So, but that's a really small group. But there's a much larger group that has the same tradition of making a pilgrimage to the holy site, and they have taken the word we used for their word, and it's Hajj, the Hajj. And we called our holiday of Sukkot the Chag, which became the Arabic word Hajj. All right, on to the Mishnah. You see the pictures? That is a room where the incense was put together. And you can see on the right, it looks kind of small, but note the columns, and you could look, the priest could look into it. So the rabbis and scholars who wrote the Mishnah in Tractate Kedoshim tried to write down everything that they had heard about. And this is later, this is like 100 years later. They tried to write down everything they had heard about, or they could find little scraps about that they could remember of every detail about what went on in the temple. So if you read the Mishnah, it's a guidebook to how to put the temple together, how to do the sacrifices, everything. So from one section, Mishnah Tamid, the priest would keep watch in 3 places in the temple courtyard in honor of the temple, like guards in the royal courtyards, so that the pictures that you see here are the chamber of Avtinas, which is where the incense was prepared. So the Mishnah tells us where the people stood, what time they got up, how they rotated. There was actually a lottery. They would get up, and then there would be a lottery of who would get to mix the incense that day, where they slept, what kind of clothing they would sleep in, on and on and on, every possible detail. Now, the New Testament has some things to say about the Second Temple as well. And you probably know the story about Jesus and the moneylenders. It's reported in a lot of different places, but here in John 2, it said, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem because that's what males were supposed to do. And he found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of monies, and they were sitting outside. This was a huge industry. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, in other words, he got some branches together, whips together, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overthrew the tables. And he said to the people that were selling the doves, "Take those away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." So there's a criticism of the temple here in the New Testament. But we get a picture of what it might have looked like or felt like, or what we might have experienced there. On to today. So how many people have been in the tunnels in Jerusalem? Have you been there? Yeah, actually, that's someplace we have not been. And looking forward to getting back there to see what's underneath. So and I got an article from 2020 that talks about some of the archaeological discoveries underneath. And here you see some archaeologists working beneath the Western Wall. And there are all these rooms and not really sure what they were used for. And so they're making discoveries every day about what archaeology is continuing to tell us the story. And the tunnels play a big role in this book because Esther's father hides things in the tunnels. Esther, there's money there, there's her ketubah, her marriage contract. And at one point, Esther tries to escape through the tunnels. But because of loyalty to her family, she goes back and stays through the siege of Jerusalem. Which brings us a little bit to the plot, which in my feeling is probably the most important piece to tell us what happened, but perhaps the least important in that there's so much else going on in the book that the plot just moves us along. So it is truly, this book is truly Esther's story, the story of one girl who becomes a woman and who grows up in a very traumatic time and survives. Spoiler alert, she survives, yay. So it goes for about 65 to 80 CE in the first century. And when we get at the opening of the book, Rome has already occupied Judea. In fact, we invited them in. Okay, remember this is around the time of, just right after Julius Caesar and all that, and they get there. We've invited them in because our country was in turmoil. And so the leaders think that the Romans can establish order and we can coexist with the Romans. Well, that did not turn out to be true. 5 years later, because of the Great Revolt, it might have happened anyway, I don't know, but with all the fighting, the Romans just decided to come in and level the ground. And by even at this time, even in the first century, but certainly by 80, because we know from Esther that Jews are living in Italy. And how did they get there? They either traveled there as merchants and just stayed, or they were taken there as slaves. And maybe there are other ways they got there too. Okay, let's look at Esther's story and see how she progresses through everything. She starts out as an aristocrat. That's the cover of the book. She becomes a trapped Jew in the siege and has to live through that. And the main description of this time is how hungry she is. First there's inflation. Oops, did I just mention that word? Okay. And then there's lack of food. And they pretty much almost starve to death. And then they're captured and they get out. But she and her brother Mati are taken as slaves. And see a picture of a Roman slave. And as she survives that and is freed and lives in Rome and lives actually a good life, but dies young. She dies, we think, we could be in childbirth. Okay. Here's the thing that interests me the most are the themes of the book. So much is brought out in this book. Okay, so look at the picture at the top. That is, you recognize the wall. This is Jerusalem today. And you recognize the wall. And look at the bottom. That's the frieze from the Arch of Titus. So there's the menorah. That's what it looked like. That's the Romans made a copy of it. So, and we recognize it because we use it in all of our art, and we have lots of menorahs that look like that. Although we've gotten pretty creative with menorahs and Chanukiot and things. But you can see that they're carrying off things from the temple. all kinds of things. The thing at the left of the menorah is probably one of those pans they use to clear off the ashes. And then there's horns on the right. So they carried every, these things were all made of gold. The temple was very rich, and so there were a lot of spoils. All right, so, and today we have the wall, and we have the tunnels underneath the wall, and we have Jerusalem, and it's the beautiful city. Okay, what are some of the themes? One is Jewish time. So every culture operates in its own way. And so Jewish time, we have the names of our months, and at the beginning of the header of of the different chapters, our author will give the Jewish year and the Jewish month. So she will say July 65 CE or Tammuz 3825. So we're constantly reminded, and she brings up that the year cycles around the various pilgrimage festivals. And there is even a description at Passover of having a meal. So the Seder was beginning to be produced at this time. But if things, and there's that wine festival in the summer. So the year goes according to Jewish time, and we really immersed in that, in our culture of that time. Another theme is everyday Jewish life. Like what did you do every day? You know, you got up and you worked, you might have studied, you went to the marketplace, you went out into collect herbs or mushrooms or flowers, and wandered through the woods. You had, you thought about, Esther thought about growing up and getting married and having children, and where things were kept in her house. She had to go to the cellar to get various things. She had to go outside to the garden to get other things. So she had to go to the roof. So you really get a feeling of what it was like to live there. Of course, there's a coming of age story and finding love. I showed you her 3 suitors, and she does interact with all of them. She keeps telling her parents she's not going to marry Lazar, but she does get engaged to him, and she does marry him. Finally, she gives up so that she'll have a place, and so her family will have food, and finally marries him during the siege. Unfortunately, he leaves, and that's another story. Family loyalty is a huge theme here. Esther wants desperately to do all sorts of things. She's rebellious. She wants to learn to be educated. Her father teaches her to read Hebrew, and he teaches her Greek. But her mother's not happy about that. But so she's loyal to her family, and even though she gets educated a bit, actually a lot, but she's loyal to her family in that she learns how to do all of the things that a young woman is supposed to learn how to do. She's loyal to her family when she wants to leave, and her mother urges her to stay, and then Miriam urges her to stay. She wants to try to escape through the tunnels, but she goes back into Jerusalem. She is always loyal to her family, and even when it is to her detriment. So since this is a time of war, we hear a lot about survival. In war, there's an enormous amount of hunger. She goes from being wealthy and having every need met to not being able to eat or even take a bath or do everyday things. She gets taken as a slave. There's a lot of description of what a slave's life was like, how you had to sit on the ground while the masters were eating, how you had to wear a certain slave face so that they didn't know what you were thinking, how you couldn't look them in the eye. There's a lot of detail about how Esther as a person felt in these situations. Freedom is a big theme here. The Zealots wanted freedom, the Sicarii wanted freedom, Esther wanted freedom. Everybody just wanted to live an everyday life. And she wanted freedom to learn and to go to the marketplace and to interact and to have a family and to have children. And the Jews wanted freedom from the Romans, who were changing their way of life. And the Romans were following orders. So, who knows what those soldiers thought. They were getting paid, so they probably felt that that was their path. So freedom for the Jews and freedom for the temple to exist and freedom for our way of life to exist is on every page of this book. As I mentioned already, education of women is a big thing. Esther wanted to learn how to read, and she did in the book. She learns how to read Hebrew and Greek. Her father tells her all the stories. She was born around Purim time, so she was named Esther. She knows her story. She tells Mati, her younger brother, the story. She uses Jewish stories to convince her father that she has to be able to read so that she can sign the ketubah and read it and understand what it says. All of this of the events in the story are from 2,000 years ago, but I think we see it on the front page of the newspapers every day. And I'm not going to Colleyville, Texas, and that business. What I'm thinking about is about powerful people taking over other people and putting them in great danger. And I just, when I read about or Afghanistan, I think about education of women or not. I think about this, how I see story after story after story of how hungry they are and how are they going to make it through the winter. I see the families who are there, being loyal to each other and what their life is like every day. So while we think that these horrible things that happened in the past are part of past history, unfortunately, we as humans are still living through these kinds of things. So that brings us to the question. At the end of this book, or near the end of this book, when the temple is destroyed, the people of Jerusalem and the Jewish world thought that everything was lost. So they asked themselves the question, is it all over for us? What will happen? And somehow the miracle is it wasn't over. And look at us sitting around this table today. We're here. The Romans did not destroy us. We took what we were loyal to. We took what we valued. We took all the good and bad things we did, and we've taken them to our hearts. And here we are, and we're going forward. So there's some things to ponder. All through the book, the Jews say that many of the Jews say that we can fight. God is going to protect us. And all through the book, well, guess what? The temple got destroyed. A lot of people got killed. A lot of people got taken into slavery. Bad things happened. So that's something we can ponder even today. So we have to think about what's God's role in protecting the Jewish people. And that brings us to our own feelings about what we think about God, if we even think about God. Next thing that this book brought to my mind is, what's the human role in protecting the Jewish people, or protecting the planet, protecting the people of the earth? or protecting as we go out into space? What's our human role? Also, I started to think about what in my life would be worth fighting for. And I've also thought about other times in my life. I think I've been pretty lucky to have really not lived any of these things. But what would I do to survive? What ends would I go to survive? What would I eat? Where would I run? Who would I steal from? What would I and of course we have these stories from our own fairly recent past. And finally, the destruction of the temple destroyed the Jewish religion as it was. So can we change our basic worldview and still be true to ourselves? How does that work? If suddenly if we live in America, what if suddenly America disappears and we're living here in Connecticut? How do we survive that? Where is that going to go? Or maybe not even that big a thing. Just if you've always grown up thinking you were going to do one thing and then you have to do something totally different, how can you be true to yourself? Well, our author at the end says, and the king quotes from the Megillah of Esther, which Esther, of course, knew really well, and buys a copy at the end of a Megillah in Rome. And she says, and the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? That's what King Ahasuerus says to her. What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half a kingdom. So Esther believes that somehow whatever she most desires is going to really happen for her. And Esther ends up as a slave being taken to Rome, living in Rome. She gets rescued and she's taken and freed through various legal procedures, very well described. And she gets taken to southern Italy to live in peace. And that's where she's buried with that actual tombstone. So this is what Laurie Banauf Kaufman imagines that all of this other stuff happened to her. But she does have the tombstone as proof that someone named Esther, and she got her name Esther got changed to Aster, which means star in Latin, by her rescuer, whom if you haven't read the book, I won't tell you. But she wasn't the only person to get there. Many Jews ended up in Italy, and they became the Romani Jews. We actually have Roman Jews. We actually have people here in Stamford who are descendants of Romani Jews. It's actually Nancy Schiffman's family, if you know Nancy from the JCC, are Romani Jews. And other Jews had businesses and settled in Italy, and then they started moving on and upward, and eventually became the Ashkenazi Jews of Europe. So our Esther Bat Hanan eventually becomes what most of us sitting around, the ancestor of what most of us sitting around this table are descendants of Ashkenazi Jews. So we're all connected to this book. I just wanted to thank you. And I hope that you all are zygazant. And I think everybody knows my email. But please call me, talk to me. But comments, has anyone read the book? Or does anyone have any questions about the book? Yeah, Gail. Or just open your mic and talk.
You were great. You were great. You put it all together for me. One comment that I have is an observation, and that was every chapter was in Roman numerals.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Get the feeling of Roman.
Right. So you have the month and the year in Jewish time, but there's all Roman. That's right. Duh. And a lot of our world today is based on what Rome set up for us, like our calendar, our numbers. Thank you to the Arabs for Arabic numerals, because I could never add and subtract in Roman numerals. Thank you, Anne.
Subtract you could, can't multiply.
There you go. And they gave us anyway, that's another day. Anne could tell you all about that. But anyway, this is just such an important piece of history. And do you know much about the Second Temple period or the destruction of the temple? Do you know what you were taught? What were you taught about it? I mean, or have you read other things about it? Yeah, well, there is one incident that happens right after this that we're all pretty familiar with. And the Zealots go on outside of Jerusalem to continue the fight at a very famous place called Masada.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that is part of this story too. It doesn't make it into Laurie Banauf Kaufman's book, but that is the rest of the story, is the story Masada lo tipo. Masada will never fall again. That's what we say today. And yeah, Peter, yeah, go ahead. Just open your mic and start talking.
Fabulous. And, you know, we all know to a lesser or greater degree the story. And for you to put it together like that really ties a ribbon around the story. And I learned a lot. And thank you so much for bringing this book to us and sharing the story. And the very fact that, Gail, you read the book, I get to give you a great kudos on that. I obviously did not read the book. Not that it isn't a desire of mine to do that, but really excellent presentation and very well thought through and presented. And thank you very much for bringing it to us.
Thank you. Well, I learned a lot, I have to say. It's an easy read, but it has been sticky. I'm still thinking about it. And I want to shout out to Judah Plotner, who handed me the book and said, "You need to read this." And Laurie Banauf Kaufman is a friend of mine. And so he said, I want to share her. I want people to know about her, but you need to read this. Yeah, Beverly. Yeah, I think you want.
So, you know, it's interesting. You started off by saying with the different reviews that some people thought it was long. And yet I didn't know, as I read it, I never felt like it was dragging, but it's one of those books. And I read it when it first came out. So we're talking a year ago. I can still remember the history, but the details of the story that stuck with me and the pieces. And you put it for those who haven't read it, you did a phenomenal job of putting it together so that you ended up with the sequence and the confusion of Esther and what happened with the temple. But I think it's one of those remarkable pieces of history that she made very everyday. And coincidentally, David was reading a nonfiction about the development of Jerusalem and a piece of it. And he would be saying to me, "Oh, listen to this piece of information." And I could tell him what happened next because she was so clear in her story and a lot of it paralleled. So I thought it was a phenomenal book and you did a phenomenal job. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I do recommend it. And one thing I liked about it was that every chapter is like 2 or 3 pages. So I felt like I was accomplishing something.
Yeah.
And it's
It gave a nice sequence in terms of history. And it gave you a feeling of all the things that we know exist in terms of Judaism, and it put it in place. It was good.
I was just going to say, I think one measure of a great book talk is if it convinces you to read the book, and you've definitely accomplished that.
Yeah.
good.
Mm.
As you're
Laurie,
reading-
my check better be in the mail.
As you're reading it, you're really hoping, and you're by Esther's side. She's right there with you, or you're right there with her. And everything that she's going through, the struggles, her ideas, her suggestions, and what she accomplishes. You're just like right there with her. It was so well written.
It's also not X-rated. She talks about harassment, not really rape, but she talks about wars and wounds. She talks about childbirth. She talks about love and sex, but it's not X-rated. On the other hand, it's sort of more powerful because she sort of talks around it, and you can imagine the rest.
You said she took 10 years in research.
Yeah, she researched it for a long time.
Has she written any other book?
She has, but they're not. This is her first novel. They're things that she did for work or other things. No, this is it. This is her beginning, hopefully.
Is there other books similar to this that you would suggest? About like a Jewish experience, maybe a different era?
We had a lot of Beverly, are you coming up with something?
I do.
So many, and I'm drawing a blank.
Well, one of them that when I started reading it, it reminded me of the doves. What was the story with the dove?
The Dove Keepers.
The Dove Keepers.
Yes, that's a good parallel.
You're living through the history as if you were there.
Right. There's not much written about this time, and I mean, unless you really want to struggle, I wouldn't read Josephus.
That's
the only other one, but this goes way back, is Steinberg's book.
Right. Oh, yes, that's right. Milton Stein.
What's it called?
Right, As a Driven Leaf. Yes.
As a Driven Leaf. That is fascinating. And
It's a beautiful book.
Mm-hmm.
It's an old book, but really very well written.
Right.
What
So,
was the name? What was it?
As a Driven Leaf.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about the rabbinic period, and it's in this time period too, and
it's about basically about the time of the Greeks, and the decision whether or not you want to stay religious or not.
Right. It's the culture clash, and
right.
Listen, we're all involved in culture clash every day with the next generation. So. Of our own kids and grandchildren. So, things keep changing. But yes, it's about culture clash, major culture clash. And of course, we live it politically here in our own country, but also worldwide. I mean, they're different. There's all kinds of culture clashes. So.
Obviously, this is an excellent book talk. And we've had some good ones, but this is fabulous. And I'm really taken by the number of people that have read the book. And now that and thank you all. And Elissa, thank you very much. Fabulous book.
Elissa, you're very tough for the next people. You know that.
Yeah, you bet it is.
Well,
it only gets better.
Well, I got news for you. This is true of whatever Elissa does. Whatever happens then is really a tough act to follow. And thank you so much, Elissa, for sharing the story. And I'm going to try to get to read it myself. No promises, though. I'm going to try to get to read it myself. Take care, everyone, and thank you for coming and attending.
Okay,
Thank you, everybody.